For decades, France has sold the world a very particular fantasy, not just baguettes and cafes, but a moral fantasy, that you can have a first-world lifestyle, a generous welfare state, early retirement, universal healthcare, strong unions, long vacations, and somehow never have to face the bill. To Americans, France looks like the country that figured it out. To many Europeans, it looks like the last holdout against Anglo-American capitalism. To tourists, it looks rich, calm, cultured. But beneath the croissants and the ideology, France is quietly running out of optoins. And not in the dramatic, Argentina-style collapse way. Not with tanks or hyperinflation or breadlines, and this is actually worse. This is the slow suffocation of a developed country that promised too much, taxed too much, reformed too little, and now finds itself mathematically cornered. France today is not poor in the way developing countries are poor. It is poor in the way a heavily leveraged household is poor, still living well, still paying bills, but increasingly using debt to pretend nothing has changed. And the numbers are no longer subtle. France now carries over 3 trillion euros in public debt, roughly 113 to 115% of GDP, depending on the estimate. It has not run a budget surplus since 1980. That means more than 4 decades of spending more than it earns, under left-wing governments, right-wing governments, and centrist governments alike. Different rhetoric, same addiction. What made this survivable for years was one thing: cheap money. Interest rates were near zero. Borrowing felt painless. Politicians could kick the can without consequences, but that era is over. In 2021, France paid roughly 35 billion euros a year just to service its debt. By 2025, that number has exploded to 67 billion euros, more than France spends on its military, and closing in on its education budget. Forecasts now openly discuss 100 billion euros a year by the end of the decade if rates remain elevated. France is approaching a point where it will spend more money paying for yesterday than investing in tomorrow. That is not a temporary problem, rather, it is a structural decay. Americans often misunderstand the French welfare state because they imagine it as generosity funded by efficiency. It's not. It's generosity funded by demographics that no longer exist. France spends around 57% of GDP through the public sector, the highest share in the developed world. Social spending alone consumes over 30% of GDP, higher than Sweden, Denmark, or Germany. And the single biggest driver inside that number is pensions. France has one of the longest retirements on Earth, close to 25 years on average, compared to roughly 19 years in the United States. Even after raising the retirement age from 62 to 64, a reform that triggered months of riots, France still retires earlier than almost every major economy. Here's the part that shocks outsiders. In France, the average pensioner earns as much as, or more than, the average worker. This is almost unheard of globally. In most systems, retirement means a reduction in income. In France, it often means stability or even improvement. And unlike the US or Australia, France does not pre-fund these pensions in large investment pools. It is a pay-as-you-go system. Today's workers pay for today's retirees. There is no stockpile. No cushion. No capital growth doing the heavy lifting. That worked beautifully when France was young, growing, industrializing, and adding workers every year. It breaks when society ages. In 1981, France had about 5 million retirees. Today, it has 17 million. By 2050, projections suggest 23 million. At the same time, fertility has collapsed from around 2.0 children per woman in 2010 to roughly 1.6 today, and falling. The working-age population is shrinking. Productivity growth is stagnant. So you end up with a brutal equation: more retirees but fewer workers, and stagnant productivity. Results in exploding pension costs paid by a shrinking base. This is not ideology, just simple maths. And arithmetic does not negotiate. At this point, defenders of the French model usually pivot to a comforting argument. Yes, debt is high, but France is rich. It will grow. Growth will fix this. Except, where is that growth supposed to come from? France has deindustrialized faster than almost any major Western economy. Manufacturing has fallen from over 25% of GDP in 1980 to roughly 10 to 13% today, depending on how you count it. Germany sits near double that share. Poland now rivals France in industrial output. Factories didn't just disappear. They moved. High labor costs, driven by social charges that can add 40 to 50% on top of gross wages, made France one of the most expensive places in Europe to manufacture anything. So companies did the rational thing. Michelin shifted production to Poland. Renault moved assembly to Romania and Morocco. PSA closed plants and relocated eastward. What replaced industry? Tourism. Luxury. Services. Paris thrives. LVMH exports handbags. Luxury brands generate tens of billions in revenue. But step outside the Paris Ring Road, and you enter a different country. Youth unemployment over 15 to 18% in some regions. Hollowed-out towns. Shrinking tax bases. Aging populations dependent on transfers. France didn't become post-industrial because it built something better. It became post-industrial because it priced itself out of making things. And services alone cannot fund a welfare state designed for an industrial superpower. Normally, a country facing this kind of fiscal squeeze would do something unpleasant but necessary: reform. France can't. Since 2017, France has burned through 7 prime ministers. Snap elections in 2024 produced a parliament split into hostile blocs, left, center, right, none able to govern alone. Every meaningful reform angers at least 2 sides. Coalitions collapse. Governments fall. Markets watch. Bond investors don't just care about debt levels. They care about decision-making capacity. That's why France now pays a significantly higher borrowing rate than Germany, reflected in a widening French-German bond spread. That spread feeds into mortgages, business loans, and consumer credit. Political paralysis becomes an economic tax paid by everyone. And here's the dangerous irony. Italy, famous for chaos, now looks more stable than France, because it has a governing majority and a credible medium-term plan. France has neither. When rating agencies downgrade France, they're not just judging numbers. They're judging whether France is still capable of choosing pain today to avoid disaster tomorrow. So far, the answer appears to be no. Why this matters beyond France? If you're American, it's tempting to watch this from a distance and shrug. But France is not Greece. It is the EU's second-largest economy, a nuclear power, a pillar of the Eurozone. If France stumbles, the entire European financial architecture shakes. Unlike the United States, France does not control its own currency. It cannot print euros. It relies on investor confidence and European Central Bank tolerance. Roughly half of French government debt is held by foreign investors. That makes France acutely vulnerable to shifts in sentiment. This is why whispers of IMF or ECB intervention, once unthinkable, are now openly discussed by economists. Not because France will collapse tomorrow, but because it is running out of options. One of the most misunderstood things about France, especially by Americans, is income. On paper, French salaries don't look terrible. In reality, they are an illusion carefully constructed by the tax system. Here's the part most people miss. When a French company hires you, the number you see on your contract is not what you cost the employer. And what you receive in your bank account is not what you earn. Let's walk through this slowly. Suppose a company is willing to spend 60,000 euros a year to hire a mid-level professional. That's the real economic value of your labor. Before you see a single euro, the state takes a massive chunk in employer social contributions. Poof! Gone. Your gross salary is suddenly closer to 43,000 euros. Then the state hits you again with employee contributions for pensions, healthcare, unemployment insurance. Another large bite. Now you're down to roughly 33,000 euro net. But wait, you still owe income tax. By the time the money actually reaches your account, nearly half of what your employer paid for your labor has vanished into the state. France now confiscates roughly 48% of GDP through taxes and social charges, the highest burden in the OECD. Higher than Scandinavia. Higher than Germany. Far higher than the United States. This creates a vicious economic trap. Companies cannot afford to raise net wages because the tax wedge is enormous. Workers feel permanently squeezed, even when employed. Disposable income stagnates. Consumption weakens. Growth slows. And when growth slows, the state doesn't cut spending. It raises taxes. This is not a welfare state anymore. It's a pressure cooker. France has quietly developed a phenomenon economists call smikification. The SMIC is the French minimum wage. It rises aggressively with inflation, faster than median wages. That sounds compassionate. But here's the unintended consequence. Today, over 17% of French workers are on minimum wage, and millions more earn just slightly above it. The gap between minimum wage and median income has collapsed. In some cases, the difference is only a few €100 a month. Think about what that does psychologically. You study for 5 years. You manage people. You carry responsibility. And you take home barely more than someone stocking shelves. At that point, ambition dies. Why work harder? Why take risks? Why innovate? This isn't equality. It's a motivation vacuum. And the state reinforces it by treating success as suspicious. France historically taxed wealth simply for existing, not for generating income. Macron softened that, but the cultural message remains: if you get ahead, expect punishment. The result is predictable. Entrepreneurs leave. High earners relocate. Young professionals mentally disengage. France doesn't lose people dramatically. It loses drive quietly. If you want to understand France's future, stop watching pension protests and start watching young people. According to Le Monde, roughly 16% of French citizens aged 18 to 29 live below the poverty line. Youth unemployment sits around 18%, among the highest in the developed world. Housing costs have surged, especially in urban centers. Meanwhile, pensions keep rising. In 2023, when wages lagged inflation, the government raised pensions by 5.3% at a cost of €14 billion to protect retirees' purchasing power. Young workers got inflation. Retirees got compensation. As one French paper bluntly put it, in France, the old are nearly kings. This isn't accidental. Retirees are the largest, most disciplined voting bloc in the country. Politicians know exactly who punishes reform at the ballot box. So France protects the past at the expense of the future. That is not sustainable in a democracy or an economy. At this point, some Americans say, okay, fine. Debt is high. But the US has huge debt too. This comparison misses the most important difference. The United States controls the world's reserve currency. France does not. The US can borrow in its own currency, inflate debt away, and rely on global demand for dollars. France borrows in euros it does not control. Its debt is priced by markets it cannot command. Japan gets away with extreme debt because most of it is domestically held. France's debt is largely held by foreign investors. If confidence cracks, borrowing costs spike immediately. And that feedback loop is already visible. France's bond yields have climbed toward 3.5%, while Germany remains significantly lower. That spread feeds directly into the real economy, mortgages, corporate loans, public investment. Political dysfunction becomes an interest surcharge paid by households and businesses. This is why rating agencies matter here. This is why investors are nervous. This is why France cannot afford paralysis. So what are France's options? There are only 4, and none are painless. 1 is serious reform. Later retirement. Lower benefits. Leaner state. Politically explosive. 2 is massive tax hikes. Already near the ceiling. Risk capital flight and deeper stagnation. 3 is inflation by stealth. Let purchasing power erode quietly. Punish savers. Delay reckoning. 4 is slow decline. Borrow more. Service debt. Hollow out investment. Pretend nothing is wrong. So far, France is choosing option 4. And that's the most dangerous one. Because decline doesn't trigger urgency. It breeds denial. France will not collapse. It will age, shrink, and stiffen, while younger, more flexible economies pass it by. The cafes will stay open. The protests will continue. The math will keep worsening. And one day, the choice will no longer belong to voters. It will belong to bond markets. France is not a warning against compassion. It's a warning against refusing trade-offs. You cannot promise Scandinavian welfare, Mediterranean retirement, German stability, and American consumption, without American growth or American monetary power. Eventually, someone pays. In France, that someone is the future. And futures, once sold, are very hard to buy back.